Ireland, 1926. Dublin's famous Abbey Theatre sold out for the fourth night in a row with a new play by Sean O'Casey. As the curtain rose, audience members greeted the cast with rounds of enthusiastic applause. But during Act 3, that would change. Praise turned to jeers as the audience stormed the stage, attacked the actors, and began singing the Irish national anthem. O'Casey's play, a satire of war and violence, had incited its own riot.
He was a controversial man in a time of controversy, in the time when the church was trying to run the country, when the patriots were trying to run the country. And anybody who criticized them, look out. You're anti-patriotic. You're anti-religious. You're the devil.
When I write a new play, when I sit down to try to write a new play, I've had the experience of many plays before. Yet that new play that I am going to try to write gives me the same agony, the same trouble, the same effort, the same Herculean work as the very first play I ever wrote gave to me.
In 1923, Ireland welcomed playwright Sean O'Casey into its literary circle.
He was always quarrelsome. He had a lover's quarrel with the world, as I say. I like cranky people. He was very cranky.
O'Casey wrote candidly about the Irish as he saw them in the slums of Dublin. Poor, oppressed, sometimes drunk, sometimes inept, but always very human.
He was about kind of putting himself out there and being honest and saying, I am who I am, and if you don't like it, then you can go whistle up a rope.
O'Casey grew up during a turbulent time in Ireland. After nearly 8 centuries under British rule, the Irish were ready for revolution.
You could easily be swallowed up by English culture, and that's what the English wanted. They tried to get rid of the Irish language, to subdue the people so they become Protestants. You know the whole story. But they didn't succeed. And what is there about the Irish characters? They're so stubborn, so obdurate that they held on, even though they were in every way they were at the bottom of the heap.
By the early 20th century, Ireland was desperate to define herself on the world stage, not as a colony of England, but as a culture all her own. Patriotic groups sprang up to revive interest in all things Irish, including Gaelic language, music, and theater.
Putting Ireland on stage was a really important part of the Nationalist Project. If you could change the way people saw themselves, then you could change the way people thought about the national question, and you could get people to be more kind of fired up about national liberation.
In 1904, Dublin's Abbey Theatre became the hub for Ireland's cultural revival.
That was part of the Abbey's original mission statement, right? That we're going to show that Ireland can be something more than the home of just buffoonery and easy sentiment.
It would take 15 years before aspiring playwright Sean O'Casey would knock on the Abbey's door, hoping to get his plays produced. Born in 1880, O'Casey had descended into extreme poverty by the time he was 10. He was frail and suffered from ulcerated eyes, which threatened to leave him completely blind. He didn't learn to read until he was 12. Once he did, he read plays.
He read voraciously, even with those bad eyes. He knew his Shakespeare, he knew his Swift, and so on. And then he was able to think for himself. That's the thing. He wasn't formed or conditioned by the school system. He went and thought for himself and came to his own conclusions.
As a young man, O'Casey entered the working class as a laborer on the Great Northern Railway. He observed appalling conditions and unfair practices at the hands of labor bosses, which inspired him to join Dublin's workers' rights movement. Its leader was an avowed socialist and mentor to O'Casey, Jim Larkin.
For O'Casey, one of the worst things about being working class or being poor was that people assumed you didn't need or want anything other than material necessities. You can see how earnest he is about Larkin as somebody who is going to transform these people.
O'Casey joined Jim Larkin in fighting for the rights of Dublin's poorest citizens, most of whom lived in overcrowded tenement houses. The Dublin tenements were among the worst slums in Europe and had become breeding grounds of disease and starvation. But as patriotic revolutionary fever spread, O'Casey watched the needs of the working class take a back seat to Ireland's growing political goal of independence.
He felt that just trying to separate Ireland from England wasn't really going to change things. It wasn't going to make Ireland the kind of place that he wanted it to be. No, people are still going to be living in slums, people are still going to be poor, they're still going to be exploited. Just changing the flag is not going to do very much for the people that I care about.
In 1916, Irish rebels mounted a violent uprising in Dublin that would summon war and provide O'Casey with chilling literary inspiration. The Easter Rising, as it was called, was crushed by British forces, but not before the destruction of the city, hundreds of civilian deaths, and the certainty of future violence between England and Ireland. In the midst of the revolutionary movement, O'Casey was finding his voice as a writer, and it was political. He began to criticize rebels, patriots, and the church for abandoning Dublin's poor. In a published article, O'Casey lashed out at the largest patriotic group at the time, the Irish Volunteer Army.
In Dublin alone, 20,000 families are wriggling together like worms in a putrid mass in horror-filled one-room tenements. Not in the shouts of the deluded volunteers, but in the hunger cry of the nation's poor is heard the voice of Ireland.
That's the thing about O'Casey. He couldn't stand hypocrisy. These pompous, patriotic speeches that we hear all the time, the same banalities. He couldn't stand that. And that's why he resorted to his own type of poetic prose.
As Ireland entered a war of independence against England in 1919, O'Casey watched the needs of the poor get further eclipsed. He began to write plays to give them a voice.
You have a political background for all of the plays, but there is this mundane, daily problem of struggle and survival that is more important than saving Ireland or fighting for Ireland. So his plays bring the situation down to the ordinary daily struggle for life against a backdrop of war and death and sacrifice.
He was really giving humanity to these characters that nobody else was paying attention to or interested in. He wasn't the only playwright to write about the slums, but I think he was the first playwright to kind of make it come to life.
O'Casey set his sights on the Abbey Theatre. Its directors, respected poet and playwright William Butler Yeats, and a playwright named Lady Augusta Gregory, would reject his politically charged plays for the next 3 years. But they were intrigued by O'Casey's writing style. Lady Gregory took O'Casey under her wing and encouraged him to write more about the tenements.
She's probably the biggest influence on him in terms of being a playwright, in that she kind of steered him in that direction. And that really was what made him successful, was drawing these very kind of vivid characters who were very funny and witty, but also very touching and heartbreaking and so forth.
In 1923, O'Casey was finally accepted at the Abbey with a play set in the tenements where he himself lived. It was called Shadow of a Gunman. Shadow of a Gunman takes place during Ireland's War of Independence. It satirizes the violent strategy and Catholic rhetoric of the war's so-called heroes.
He was questioning the things that are sacred. In Ireland, what is sacred is what the priest says, what the patriot says. And this sacredness has got to be questioned, not by editorials or ideology, but by characters who represent questioning of it. In the Shadow of a Gunman, Seamus Shields says, I'm a nationalist myself. England has no right to be in this country.
It's the civilians that suffer. When there's an ambush, they don't know where to run. Shot in the back to save the British Empire. Shot in the breast to save the soul of Ireland. I believe in the freedom of Ireland and that England has no right to be here, but I draw the line when I hear the gunmen blown about dying for the people, when it's the people that are dying for the gunmen. with all due respect to the gunmen, I don't want them to die for me.
That's O'Casey allowing the character to speak for him. That's the secret in all creative work. Let the character do it. Let the paintings on the canvas do it. And this is why he's a great dramatist.
Audiences loved Shadow of a Gunman. Reviewers declared O'Casey Ireland's new gift to the world. One writer remarked, "Not for a very long time has such a good play come our way. Out of small materials, he pieced together the most genuine comedy I think I've ever seen."
Well, if you didn't have humor, who would read it? Who would want to be bothered? It's like those Russian novels that go on for 911 pages, and in page 902, Boris, the peasant, decides to commit suicide, and you wish he'd done it on page 4.
The comedy is the survival element in O'Casey. They all have this element of anger and comedy, and it saves them. It saves the plays.
Shadow of a Gunman became the first of 3 tenement plays called the Dublin Trilogy. Each confronted a different event in Irish political history. The plays would be wildly popular and controversial. In satirizing economic, political, and religious tensions, O'Casey was taking on every Irish taboo.
He's trying to bring people aware of what's happening in the city, where the church and the politicians have ignored the daily life, and he's going to say something about it.
The second play of O'Casey's Dublin trilogy, Juno and the Paycock, would tackle the Irish Civil War, a conflict that erupted after a problem